Good evening, and thank you for joining us for the Rincon Island Phase 2 Draft Feasibility Study meeting. We appreciate you joining us this evening and taking the time to engage with us. My name is Cindy Herzog, and I'm an environmental scientist with the Commission and the project manager for Phase 2 of the Rincon decommissioning. You are currently viewing all of our panelists, who I'd like to introduce at this time. Our commission staff includes Michaela Weimer, staff attorney, Peter Reagan, petroleum engineer, Kelly Connor, land management specialist, Katie Robinson-Phillip, an environmental scientist and outreach and public engagement specialist, Jennifer Maddox, our tribal liaison, and Jessica Ramirez, our environmental justice liaison. Next slide, please. Our consultant for the feasibility study is Padre Associates, Inc. And tonight we have Simon Poulter and Ryan Zucker from Padre to both present and answer questions later on. Specialists on the Padre team, as shown below, will assist in answering questions that we cannot address during this meeting. Next slide, please. Our agenda tonight will consist of presentations to address the decommissioning phases and phase 2 decision process, followed by an overview of the draft feasibility study, the next steps, and then public comment. Next slide. The decommissioning of Rincon Island and associated facilities is being addressed in 3 phases. Phase 1 included the plugging and abandonment of all oil and gas wells onshore and offshore, and the removal of equipment. This phase was completed in June of last year. Phase 2, our current phase, includes the development of a feasibility study and decommissioning plan, followed by the preparation of a CEQA document. Phase 3 will be the actual decommissioning itself, after a project and the CEQA document have been approved by the Commission. After a phase 3 decommissioning project is decided upon by the Commission, applications for potential future uses of the Rincon facilities may be processed by Commission staff. These applications will trigger the need for additional environmental review and public input at that point. Please keep in mind tonight that potential future reuses of the Rincon facilities are presently unknown and not part of the current phase 2, and for that reason were not examined in the draft feasibility study. Next slide, please. This slide provides a good visual for the phase 2 decision process. The highlighted area shows where we currently are in phase 2. As you can see, there are multiple opportunities for comment in phase 2 throughout the process that we really want you to take advantage of. After the feasibility study has been finalized, staff will take it before the Commission with a recommendation. The Commission will identify a preferred decommissioning alternative and decide what other alternatives will be analyzed in a CEQA document. A draft CEQA document will then be prepared based on the Commission's decisions and will go out for public review. After the CEQA document is finalized, it will be taken to the Commission for consideration. Next slide, please. I'm hoping by this time that all of you have already had an opportunity to take a look at the draft feasibility study. However, if not, it can be found on the Commission's website at the link shown here. A reminder that the review period does end on May 16th at 5 p.m. So I want to encourage everyone to email your comments to the email shown here at your earliest convenience. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Simon Poulter. If possible, we ask that you hold your questions and comments until the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. the next part of the presentation will really focus on giving a summary of the overall feasibility study as outlined here. The phase 2 components and the studies that were done to prepare the final engineering and technical report that resulted in the comparison of the various alternatives that we looked at. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Just briefly, I wanted to give a quick overview of the facilities that are actually included in the feasibility study. In addition to Rincon Island itself, we have the wharf structure, which is located on the inland side of the island itself. We have the causeway that leads back down to the mainland. We have the SCC, which is Coastal Conservancy Commission parcel located right on shore. And that was added to the project as we got started. And I'll go into that a little bit more detail later on. There is also a short component of onshore pipeline that is remnant from previous oil and gas transfers from the island, which was removed from the causeway, which goes across Highway 101. And then finally, the onshore facility, which is located just to the east of the island itself, located between Highway 1 and Highway 101. So we'll be talking about these areas as we go through this discussion. Next slide, please. As Cindy outlined in her introductions, we are in the phase 2 portion of the project, and phase 1 was involved in completing the well abandonments. As you can see in the island photograph here, you can see the area where the wells previously were located have been completely removed, and that area is now covered with concrete. The photograph to the right here is the end of the wharf, or the causeway as it enters the wharf. So you can see some of the components we discussed in the previous figure. Next slide, please. Onshore, we have the main onshore facility where a number of the oil and gas processing equipment and some wells were located. That area has been completely brought down to just bare dirt at this point. All the buildings and oil and gas structures have been removed from that site at this point. The picture to the right is the valve box on the inland side of Highway 101. This is where the pipelines terminate as you come across from the island itself. Next slide, please. The last area that I just wanted to bring up was the Coastal Conservancy parcel, which is located just to the east of the causeway. This site was added as we started scoping out the project. The reason we are bringing this in, because obviously the causeway terminates in this area, and we'll be looking at potential alternatives to address restoration of this site as well as the area on the beach side of that. Next slide, please. Briefly, the way that the feasibility study has been structured is we've looked at a variety of physical, biological, and engineering components and developed a series of component plans working with our engineering subconsultant, Longitude 123. These component plans were then used to identify what we are commonly calling as the 3 Rs, which is reuse, reefing, and then removal. We'll go into a little bit more detail on each of these items as we go through the presentation. Next slide, please. The component plans were developed specifically to address individual parts of the facilities that I described in the first figure. These were broken down in such a way that we could mix and match certain components and subcomponent plans associated with those activities. As you can see, it involves everything from the onshore parcels, both the onshore facility decommissioning and component plan, the SCC parcel, which is component plan 9, as well as parts of the island and the causeway and wharf structure. So these were all used in what we will describe in a little bit more detail to help define what ultimately was used to look at the potential alternatives of the project. Next slide, please. As I noted, the alternatives range from reuse, reefing, and complete removal. We've kind of highlighted in this slide what activities would be involved in each of these alternatives. As Cindy indicated, we're not looking at any specific reuse, but just the fact that the island would be brought to a condition that would allow it to be used for another use other than the historic oil and gas activities. This will include retention of the island and the causeway, but I do want to emphasize one of the important components is that we would involve removal of contaminated soil that has been identified in the island that was part of the historic oil and gas operations. We would also see remediation of the onshore facility where also contamination has been identified, and we would involve decommissioning of any other remaining oil and gas infrastructure, such as the onshore pipelines. The reefing component does involve some additional activities, removal of surface structures and pavements, but includes similar activities as previously identified in the reuse. And then finally, complete removal, it really is a removal of all infrastructure, including the island, the wharf, and all of the components. But it would involve at least the improvements to the SCC parcel at the base of the causeway. Next slide, please. For those of you who've had a chance to look at the feasibility study, you will see that there is a number of technical studies that were attached or referenced throughout the document. These studies were kind of the core component of how we addressed the ultimate recommendations regarding the alternatives and the component plans themselves. Next slide, please. These diagrams and drawings, which were prepared by Longitude 123, help illustrate some of the things that we talk about throughout the document. It both provides plans, cross sections to help explain how the island is currently sitting, as well as giving it illustrations of what activities may occur depending on which component plans are actually implemented. So these are great examples of what things would look like. Next slide, please. Here is another example of those engineering studies that were completed by Longitude, and they include illustrations of removal of the asphalt, the contamination, as well as what the seafloor would look like should the entire island be removed. Next slide, please. Any engineering study, as well as environmental study, is based on a good reconnaissance survey of all of the facilities. E-Track, which was a subconsultant to Longitude, prepared a complete subsurface and above waterline survey of the island and the causeway, which allowed us to visualize what was going on under the water. This was particularly helpful in examining how the structure has survived over the last 40 years. Are we seeing a lot of rock being displaced from it, as well as the condition around the base of the causeway and other areas of the site. Next slide. One of the other key components was a coastal engineering study completed by NV5. We really wanted to understand what is going along this section of coastline and what influence the island itself has on that, as well as the causeway. As you can see, we did look at what would happen under normal conditions. And as the island, which is located in this little area right here, we can very dramatically see in the modeling that was done that it provides a great deal of shelter of wave energy from what we would expect as storm systems or just typical waves in the area. What we also did in looking at these components was what would happen if we changed the configuration of the site, such as removal of the causeway or the island itself, and what would happen. And the results of that analysis was core to some of the assessments we did in the environmental review. And as you can see in the summary, obviously changes would occur should the island and the causeway be removed. And we get into more detail in our study itself. Next slide, please. Ryan Zucker, who joins us today on the panel, led our efforts to understand what historic oil and gas operations may have done as far as impacting either soil or groundwater, both at the onshore facility or on the island. The island itself does have some contamination associated with the previous oil and gas operations. The photograph in the lower end here shows areas where we actually did sampling, and as well as a photograph of the kind of sample that was done. This looked at both soil and interstitial water in the island, and obviously the island is surrounded by water. We also sampled the water around the island and in the rocks to make sure that we didn't see any signs of contamination. More detail about the procedures and what the results of that analysis are included in the report. Onshore, the petroleum contamination was identified in both soil and groundwater. That again was as a result of the historic operations. Next slide, please. Very early on in our study, we undertook a study with UCSB scientists, including Milton Love, and we did a complete biological survey around the island, as well as did an assessment of the health of that. The results of that and these pictures clearly indicate that the island is serving as a hard substrate, which is not typical of the area around the island. Therefore, the biodiversity is quite significant when compared to the more sandy or muddy bottom that you would typically find in this area. Next slide, please. One of the components of the feasibility study was to complete an environmental assessment or screening of the environmental issues that may result from one of the three alternatives. This was not a CEQA level review, but more of a guide for us and the team working with state lands to determine what may or may not happen as a result of some of the actions chosen here. This was also done to help inform you as readers of the report of what potentially could occur depending on the scenarios. Next slide, please. The areas we looked at are pretty typical of an environmental document that we would normally prepare for a project. These included aesthetics, air quality, biological resources, cultural and tribal cultural resources, and ongoing efforts to consult with our local tribal leaders, geology and soils, hazardous materials, which includes the site assessment, hydrology and water quality, which could be impacted from hydrocarbons in the area or during actual demolition work, noise, recreation, transportation, commercial fishing, and of course, sea level rise and climate change. Next slide, please. So what we've done after completing that screening was to compare the alternatives and to help everybody who's reviewing this feasibility study to get an idea of what the potential issues we would need to address should one of these alternatives be identified. Next slide, please. This table, which was developed by Jen Layton, who worked extensively on the report for Padre, helps summarize some of the discussions that are in there. We're looking at both temporary and long-term impacts. Temporary, we are typically looking at issues associated with the actual work that would be done to either remove something or prepare something. Long-term is obviously the long-term use. This summary kind of gives you a key idea of where we would want to focus our efforts in addressing potential issues under the various reuse, reefing, or removal alternative. But again, we're not looking at actual reuse alternative. That would have to be addressed at a later date once the commission makes a determine whether reuse of the island is the alternative they prefer. Next slide, please. So recognizing these potential impacts, there are both beneficial and potentially adverse impacts. But we did want to highlight a number of what we recognize as potential benefits compared through the various alternatives. So obviously with if you go to the extreme of complete removal, you've got removal of the hazardous waste as well as the improvements to the SCC parcel. but the removal of hazardous waste, such as the contaminated soil, actually would occur throughout the other alternatives. We can see with the reuse and the reefing alternative, we would retain the biological benefits. So this comparison is made in this table as a summary, but if you read the feasibility study, you will see additional discussions on potential benefits as well as impacts associated with these activities. Next slide, please. One key question that the engineering team was asked was to develop a schedule and a potential cost of these activities so that we could all understand what that would look like. So obviously, the more activities, the more likely the work days would be longer. So this summarizes what we would anticipate as the actual activities, either to prepare the island for reuse, reefing, or complete removal. Next slide, please. And finally, the cost comparison was developed based on the various components that we identified earlier in the presentation and what their incremental costs, when added up, would result from that decision. As you can see, complete removal has a very high price tag, and this removal cost reflects removing everything from the seafloor, taking it to shore, and disposing of it. So obviously a very high price tag. Last slide for me, please. So to highlight, as Cindy did in the early parts, we are just here at the very left-hand side of this diagram in the comment period for the feasibility study. Once we've received all of the comments, we will work with agency staff, with state lands to prepare a final document, and that will then go before the commission, currently looking at August of this year. The preferred alternative, once that's decided upon, will then be fed into a CEQA document, whether that document be an environmental impact report or a mitigated negative declaration is unknown at this time, but that would obviously dictate the timeline that we might need to prepare that. So this kind of gives you a sense of the next steps as we go through here. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Katie to explain how you can now participate in providing some comments on the feasibility study. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. So there are a few ways to provide comment or to ask questions. So we'll go over those now. So all attendees are muted during the presentation, and I'll be granting permission for you to unmute yourself in the order in which you raise your hand. So you can raise your hand by clicking on the icon at the bottom of your screen, and that'll alert us that you would like to provide a comment. Additionally, if you would like to not provide a verbal comment, you can also use the chat function at the bottom of the screen, and you can submit a comment that way, and we can read your comment in. If you're calling in on the phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9 on your phone, and that will raise your hand, and then we'll be able to call on you from there. And yes, if you have any questions or if you have any technical difficulties working through Zoom, please just let us know. The chat will send your comments to all of the panelists, and we will try to work out any issues that you may encounter. Thank you. And additionally, to help us guide the comments, we'd just like to set a few guidelines for what types of comments would be most helpful to us as we continue through this process. Particularly, we're especially interested in hearing from you about what issues might not have been addressed in the feasibility study that you think should be addressed. What are additional alternative modifications that you would like to see within the feasibility study? And then additionally, what other additional concerns, not including future reuse, which would be part of a separate lease application and evaluation process. But are there additional concerns that the feasibility study didn't touch upon that you think should be included in that? And additionally, please limit your comments to about 3 minutes or less. And then also, in addition to these verbal comments, again, public comments are due on May 16th by 5 p.m. So you can also submit written comments as well. And I will turn it back to Cindy, and then we will start the comment period. So again, just raise your hand and we'll start calling on you.
Well, we'll do the wrap up after the comment period. So go ahead and let's see if anyone has any thoughts.
Yes, so for our first commenter, we have John Brooks.
Hey, everybody, thank you for doing such a wonderful job on restoring the island to its current status. It sure was a mess when we visited before and made our video for Sea Frog. I'm a member of the board of Sea Frog, which is Climate First, replacing oil and gas. And my concern is that too much consultation has been with the northern Chumash tribes and not enough with the Barbareño and the coastal tribes. I noticed that Patrick Tumawait was at the island visit, as was a woman with one of the coastal tribes. And I know that Julie Tumawait since Tensley has not been consulted. And I would hope that they're really roped into the process so that they can decide what they would like to do with some of the land. My own personal thought is that it would be a great place for them to have the onshore part that used to be offshore. But that all remains to be seen. Thank you for your time and good on. Thank you.
Thank you. For our next public commenter, we have Jimmy Young.
Oh, I see. I'm supposed to unmute myself. So can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Great, sorry. Yes, I concur with the last gentleman, Mr. Brooks. We're very concerned down here in Ventura about making sure our local tribes do have a good say in this. And I am also working with some of them for the onshore parcel. I know that's in later steps, but I would like to comment on I'm a little bit confused about how long public is allowed comment. I see that through May 16th, the comment period through this feasibility study, but in that slide provided, it looks like it says ongoing public and agency agreement or engagement, and comments can be through the entire CEQA process. Is that true?
The formal process, well, not that this is a CEQA process right now, it is just a feasibility study. But for this document, in order to make it final, we're asking that there be a cutoff for the comments on the feasibility study on May 16th. But at any time, you can submit comments to us and we will do our best to answer any questions that you have. When the CEQA process starts, again, we will be going into a more formal comment period that will have a timeline. Does that make a little more sense?
It does. So there will be plenty of opportunities to participate in this research and this discussion, and that we don't have until the 16th of this month to have all of our opinions about future uses of the property, correct?
Oh, no, the future uses are definitely going to be a separate issue that we're going to address in phase 3 or before phase 3, right before. As we get in applications, which is the way that it would proceed, then we will be addressing any reuse requests. So, and that would be brought out into another environmental document, probably tearing off whatever CEQA document comes out of this process, this phase 2 process. And you would be making comments at that time as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Currently, we don't have any other hands raised. So if you would like to provide a comment, please raise your hand. Okay, our next public commenter is Dan Reddick. Dan, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Yeah, hey, I just got myself. Hey, one problem I'm having with the presentation is that all your pages weren't numbered. Like some of the pages were, and some of them were. So makes responding to some of these things a little difficult, but thank you so much for putting this together and getting everybody together tonight. So I'm going to just talk about some various things I saw through the presentation. One was the wave direction slide, the way it showed it hitting the coast and protecting or not protecting the coast, that's a very rare direction for the predominant waves that come out of the northwest during the heavy surf season. You know, the mapping of the island seemed to be a little inaccurate. I've dove the southeast corner, and what you showed there was not quite correct. Other things that just kind of popped out to mind, and absolutely the most concerning part of every part of what you presented tonight was around slides 25, 26, and 27. You came up with a format of these are the things that we should be concerned about, and not one of your criteria had anything to do with community impact. Not one. Everything was about environmental and so forth, but hey guys, that's going on right in front of our homes, and that didn't seem to be any sort of evaluation criteria. Slide number 5, I get what you're saying there, Cynthia. You basically said that, and I get from what you're doing at this stage of the process, is you're not like diving deep as to which way in which direction you're doing. But with that said, what I do want to understand is what is a selection criteria? And if you have a selection criteria, much like you showed on slides 25, 26, and 27, how is each one weighted? Will, you know, in our opinion, community impact be like up on a large percentage of the decision-making process, or will it be small? And then each one of those components, I believe that will drive your decision-making. We should understand which one is the most important to you. I guess my last comment is that, you know, from a local's perspective, it would seem that you would do the reuse first, because as I understand from prior correspondence with you, that you have done no outreach to a third party regarding the reuse of the island, whether it be tribal or whether it be public or private or however that might work. So why would you jump forward to do, you know, the reefing or the, you know, the tear down of the pier and then the tear down of the island? Why would you ever contemplate ever doing those if you didn't first do the minimal, seek out the public or private sector to decide what may be able to be used in the future? So I'm hoping we're not like jumping ahead of ourselves before we really understand the answers to the questions that might relate to the reuse of that property. I thank you for this time very much.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. Our next public commenter is Anne Martians.
Hello. I'd like to bring an item to your guys' attention that I really haven't heard anyone mention. First, I'd like to reference the coastal engineering study that for the Rincon Island decommissioning that I got via email from State Lands Commission. Specifically, I noted that in the study, it stated that removing the causeway would have no effect on near shore circulation, along shore and cross shore sedimentation rate, and shoreline and beach erosion in the surrounding area. And the study says that the impact of the causeway removal on wave climate is negligible. But when I was reading the study, it really doesn't show any data to back this. And it kind of seems like it's purely assumption. So as far as I can tell, based on the engineering study, there really wasn't any modeling done that shows specifically the effect of the removal of the causeway on nearshore waves and sand flow. And that's kind of a huge concern for me. I've spent a lifetime in and around the ocean, and I can say that I am an expert in analyzing breaking waves and nearshore currents. And in my lifetime, I've never seen a pier structure that didn't have some sort of effect on sand movement and the nearshore wave environment. And that's why reading these reports, it was kind of alarming for me. I'm extremely concerned about the integrity of the beach at Muscle Shoals, the surrounding beaches, and the ability of the public to access those beaches, the homes in the area, and specifically also the quality of surf that is produced at Muscle Shoals. I'm sure you guys know Muscle Shoals, also known as Little Rincon, as it's affectionately known around the world by surfers, has a reputation for producing world-class waves. With the proper sand conditions and the right swell angle, a wave that is produced here breaks through the causeway and in front of the rock in a barrel shape that's revered by surfers. And it's very unique, and it can break for 200 to 300 yards down the beach. And on a good day, I've seen as many as 150 surfers in the water, utilizing this as a recreational area. And removing the causeway without really any data on how it will affect that wave and that sand movement in that area seems absurd. In the feasibility study, you guys mentioned the California Coastal Act Public Relations Code 30253, and it states that new developments shall protect special communities and neighborhoods that, because their unique characteristics, are popular visitor destinations for recreational use. And that's why I'm really surprised that I haven't seen any information on recreational use of the area, because as far as I can tell, that causeway is a huge part of what makes the nearshore waves here work in a way that provides that recreational opportunity for people who ride waves, and I think it should be protected. I think if you guys do choose to do the reefing, in addition to doing some research to incorporate or show us data on how removal of the causeway does or does not affect sand movement, I'm recommending that you guys do a surf specific study to evaluate the change in recreational opportunity that removing the causeway would cause. And that has actually been done before by other people, following the precedent of the San Alejo Lagoon Conservancy when they were doing work in Cardiff. It seems like the best practice when proposing a project that will have a possible effect on sand movement and rideable wavelength and wave quality at a known surf break should be preceded by a quantitative study on surf quality, as to not neglect the recreational opportunities that are available with the causeway in place. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and thank you guys for doing diligence and performing thorough assessments of all the options that are being presented as alternatives. Thanks.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Jimmy Young again.
Yes, hi. I'd just like to concur with the person who just spoke, and that it does not appear as if the study, of which I did try and read in its entirety, addressed a partial removal of the causeway, because I have heard from someone else that the waves are affected and by the causeway, but how about a study to have a partial mover where you cut the pilings down to a certain determined length, for the added benefit of keeping all that underwater structure that we know that the biological systems are being supported so well. I was at the open house this last week out there, and I was walked the length of the causeway with a biologist, luckily, and we spoke of that, and he was concurred that keeping some of the pilings, of course, below all any ships or surfers or any kind of dangerous height, but it would promote the biological species down there, as well as perhaps even the recreational users above, with creating better waves. I'd like to see the studies, further study, to include the partial removal. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next commenter, Dan Reddick.
Hey guys, thanks so much again for letting me speak. One thing that did come up, and it's kind of tied to exactly what Annie talked about and what Jimmy were talking about. You know, we have a really good case study of what happens whenever you remove oil piers at the old oil piers that are located roughly a mile, maybe a mile and a half south of Muscle Shoals. Those piers back in the day produced a great surf break, a huge beach and so forth. The rock groins were left in place and the piers were removed, and it has since wiped out the beach. So to assume that removal of the pier will not affect sand retention on the northern part of the Breakers Way, as it spans from the corner there all the way up to the northern part near La Conchita is probably something that needs a deep dive as far as an investigation, because we have a real life situation where the pier was removed, the beach was gone, complete decimation, no longer a good recreation area. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, there's currently no one else with their hands raised. If you would like to provide comment, please raise your hand. If you're calling in by phone, again, you can raise your hand by hitting *9, and then we'll be able to call on you. And additionally, there is also the option to send a comment through the chat as well. Okay, so far there is no one else wishing to provide comments. So Cindy, I believe we can move on to the wrapping up part of the presentation.
Okay, very good. All right, well, I would like to thank everyone for participating again in this public meeting. I want to acknowledge and thank the involved tribes and our local, state, and federal agency partners, including Ventura County. We are recording this meeting, as Katie had said, and we'll place the link for the recording along with the PowerPoint presentation on our website, so you can take a look at that again. Please look for notices from us for any additional opportunities to engage and provide your insights and perspectives, ideas, concerns. You know, we do appreciate hearing from you. We do want to hear what you have to say. So have a wonderful evening, and thank you again.